Mirror of Modernity. Invented Traditions of Modern Japan. Edited by Stephen Vlastos. Chapter 1. Tradition. Past, present culture, and modern Japanese history by Stephen Vlastos. Modern Japan is widely regarded as a society saturated with customs, values, and social relationships that organically link present generations of Japanese to past generations. Especially since 1945 and the eclipse of the ideology of the emperor-centered family state, Japanese have come to know themselves and to be known by others through their cultural traditions. Group, harmony, aversion to litigation, the martial arts, industrial paternalism. These and other traditional values and practices are assumed both to predate Japan's modernization and to have contributed to its unparalleled success. It was not that long ago, in fact, that Japan specialists ascribed Japan's successful modernization to the utility of its pre-modern values and institutions, on the assumption traditions were direct cultural legacies. Readers will be surprised to discover the recent origins of age-old Japanese traditions. Examined historically, familiar emblems of Japanese culture, including treasured icons, turn out to be modern. Much of the ritual and the rules of Japan's ancient national sport, sumo, are 20th century creations. Prince Shotoku's enshrinement as an icon of Japanese communal harmony dates from the 1930s and wartime spiritual mobilization. There is little evidence of Japanese cultural aversion to litigation before the 20th century. A misnomer, the Japanese weak legal consciousness, is largely the legacy of institutional innovations of political elites since World War I. The rhetoric of warm-hearted work management relations was invented in the 1890s by capitalists seeking to fend off government regulation. At the time, labor relations on the shop floor tended to be strife-ridden and chaotic. The labor practices that today constitute Japanese-style labor management were introduced piecemeal decades later. Some were even borrowed from abroad. What does it mean that so much of Japanese tradition is a modern invention? The essays in this volume build on the critical historical approach to tradition developed by Eric Hobsbawm and employed to startling effect by the contributors to the invention of tradition. The methodological breakthrough of Hobsbawm and its collaborators was to historicize modern British and British colonial traditions and thereby reveal the ideological and constructed nature of modern tradition, an aspect of tradition scholars had only dimly perceived. Social scientists have conventionally used tradition in two overlapping and somewhat contradictory senses. First, tradition designates a temporal frame with no clear beginning, which marks off the historical period preceding modernity. Used in this way, tradition aggregates and homogenizes pre-modern culture and posits a historical past against which the modern human condition can be measured. Thus, Anthony Giddens contrasts the pervasive condition of radical doubt institutionalized by modernity with the ontological security and moral brindingness of life in traditional society, where kinship, religion, custom, and ceremony impart feelings of belonging. Used in this way, tradition is discontinuous with and stands in opposition to modernity. Traditions in the second and more frequent usage represents a continuous cultural transmission in the form of discrete cultural practices of the past that remain vital in the present. In Edward Shield's formulation, tradition is far more than the statistically frequent recurrence over a succession of generations of similar beliefs, practices, institutions, and works. The core of tradition is strongly normative. The intention and the effect is to reproduce patterns of culture. Shields writes, "It is this normative transmission which links the generation of the dead with the generations of the living. In this conception, rather than representing culture left behind in the transition to modernity, traditions is what modernity requires to prevent society from flying apart." Both conceptions of tradition are resolutely ahistorical, reproducing the linked binaries of pre-modern and modern, and stasis and change central to the Western conception of modernity that achieved a kind of apotheosis in post-World War II modernization theory. Yet, scholars who would reject out of hand the notion of timeless culture and the static past have often failed to problematize the historicity of tradition, for the normative status and repetitive practice of invented traditions powerfully naturalize them. Thus, the provocative title of Hobsbawm's volume, and especially the lead essay by Hugh Trevor Roper debunking the Scottish Highland tradition, served as a wake-up call. The timing was just right. The broad movement across the humanities to deconstruct culture had just been launched, and Hobsbawm's ironic representation of tradition as invention made an important fact unmistakably clear. Tradition is not the sum of actual past practices that have perdured into the present. Rather, tradition is a modern trope, a prescriptive representation of socially desirable, or sometimes undesirable, institutions and ideas thought to have been handed down from generation to generation. The choice of the subtitle of this project, Invented Tradition of Modern Japan, explicitly acknowledge our intellectual debt to the conceptual model redeveloped in Hobsbawm and Ranger, which mandates skepticism with regard to the historical claims of tradition. Nevertheless, a word of caution is in order. The invention of tradition, rather like the now ubiquitous concept of imagined communities, is both the title of a well-known book whose thesis broke new intellectual ground and a mobile and elastic concept captured in a seductive title phrase, which has been adopted, used, and criticized, sometimes without close attention to the specificity of the original concept. Because the contributors to this volume both borrow from and revise Hobsbawm's conception of the invention of tradition, a short sketch of these salient features is useful. In the introduction to The Invention of Tradition, Hobsbawm lays out a rigorous sociological definition of tradition, practically identical to Schill's, in which invariance is the salient characteristic. Hobsbawm does this in order to distinguish invented tradition, which he identifies with superstructural institutions and elites, from custom, which he conceives as popular and capable of being mobilized by groups and societies' base. Drawing out the contrast, Hobsbawm argues that while tradition imposes fixed practices, custom is flexible, capable of accommodating a certain amount of innovation, while still providing the sanction of precedent, social continuity, and natural law as expressed in history. Accordingly, in a world marked by constant change, the invention of tradition functions to structure at least some parts of social life within it as unchanging and invariant. Finally, invented traditions are distinguished from other genuine traditions by the fact that continuity with a historical past is largely fictitious. A frequent criticism of the concept of the invention of tradition is that all traditions are, and always have been, socially constructed, and hence, in some sense, invented. The invention of tradition, in this view, at best restates something everyone should already know, and at worst improperly denies the possibility of authentic tradition by collapsing the distinction between legitimate agency and artifice. A second and related criticism of the model arises from the dichotomy drawn between tradition and custom. Tradition, unlike custom, is said to be rigid and must be so since the intent, Hobsbawm insists, is to represent some part of modern life as unchanging. Speaking from the theoretical position of postcolonial studies, Dipesh Chakrabarty raises an important epistemological issue in the afterword related to the attribution of invariance in Hobsbawm's model. The point I will pursue is different. The conspicuous disjuncture between the rhetorical aspect of tradition represented in the claim to invariance and the continually shifting substantive aspect, which is institutionalized in practices and texts that are reorganized and reformulated over brief spans of time without apparent forfeiture of authority. This observation leads to a third and final criticism. The elite popular typologizing of tradition custom is useful only up to a point, especially when applied to cultural rather than to political traditions. It is true, of course, that most traditions are instituted and regulated by elites. In fact, it is exactly this feature that makes their study so revealing of how discourse is constituted in relation to social power in specific historical contexts. But even when elites make tradition just as they please, the practices and ideas they authorize have a tendency to take on a life of their own. Traditions, like customs, are embedded in larger social structures that are continuously reshaped by the very forces of change endemic in capitalist modernity that they aim to arrest. Each of these points warrants further discussion, both to develop a better understanding of the uses and misuses of the invention of tradition, and to indicate with reference to specific cases how the concept is deployed by the contributors to this volume. I began by noticing the common criticism of the invention of tradition, which is also the most sweeping, that the concept itself is theoretically naive, since everyone should know by now that culture is socially constructed. What, if anything, then, is gained by conjoining invention with tradition? The criticism misses the point. The primary value of the invention of tradition to the critical study of culture is heuristic rather than theoretical. It raises new and important historical questions concerning the formation of culture, even if it does not, in the end, produce criteria capable of sustaining a new or rigorous typology. Even if one were to assume, which would be foolish, common knowledge of the comparatively recent origins of most modern traditions, establishing the fact of their invention is only the first step. The significant findings will be historical and contextual. How, by whom, under what circumstances, and to what social and political effect are certain practices and ideas formulated, institutionalized, and propagated as tradition. Take, for example, the Japanese tradition of weak legal consciousness, which is the subject of Frank Upam's essay. It is instructive, perhaps even startling, to learn, as Upam argues in the first part of the essay, that before the modern era, Japanese apparently demonstrated little cultural aversion to litigation as a means of resolving conflicts. More instructive, though, is his account of the historical process through which Japanese political elites produced what, after the fact, became the tradition of weak legal consciousness. Finally, he offers an analysis of the larger implications of successful invention. The political decision to channel dispute resolution away from courts, Upam argues, imposed on subsequent generations a choice of legal cultures, whose primary effect has been to restrict the latitude and initiative not only of citizens as private actors, but also of the judiciary in the implementation of legislation, while increasing those of the bureaucracy and the executive branches of government. There are potential pitfalls inherent in the problematic of the invention of tradition, however. When invention is narrowly construed as artifice, the possibility of a legitimate exercise of agency is erased, leaving only manipulation and mystification. Quite apart from producing boring history, such a reading entails real political costs. As Arif Dirlik recently noted in relation to the history making of indigenous peoples, a theoretical position that ignores the social conditions of the production and reception of invented traditions and other tropes of identification, denies to marginal and oppressed populations legitimate recourse to the authority of the past in their ongoing struggle to fashion counter-hegemonic cultural identities. Though not as forcefully as Dirlik, Marilyn Ivy also expresses reservations in the introduction to her study of popular traditions of Japan's Tono region, with the now common critique that all tradition is invention. Ivy makes an important point. To say that all tradition is invented is still to rely upon a choice between invention and authenticity, between fiction and reality, between discourse and history. The essay in this volume take account of the double meaning of invention, which the dictionary tells us signifies both imagination and contrivance, creation and deception. Every tradition trades between these two poles, and if traditions are to retain their vitality under changing historical conditions, one can expect to find constant shifting and overlapping of signifying positions. Traditions of many duration are dystrophic rather than flat and unified. Hence, they function as multivalent and somewhat unstable cultural signifiers. This aspect of the invention of tradition, which is not sufficiently recognized, is well illustrated in Ito Kimio's discussion of one of Japan's most celebrated traditions, Wa no Seishin, the spirit of peace and harmony. Wa, one hears repeated tirelessly, has regulated Japanese community life since the misty beginnings of Japanese civilization. The injunction, harmony is to be valued, is indeed recorded in the first article of Prince Shotoku's seventh article constitution, a foundational document dating to the 7th century. But as Ito shows, this famous precept has traversed a circuitous path in arriving at the present traditional meaning. Looking at shifts of meaning in the modern period alone, one sees that in Meiji, Wa no Seishin signified the ethical basis of the state and prescribed a hierarchical social order. Under the pressure of wartime mobilization in the 1930s and during the Pacific War, Wa, Ito argues, first came to signify communal unity, as in the ubiquitous slogan, "All people, one mind." However, it was only in the radically altered political, social, and economic conditions of the post-war era that Wa no Seishin acquired its current meaning of cooperation among equals. Finally, as marvelously illustrated by the spatial ordering of the employee's face in a bank's New Year's greeting card from the era of high economic growth, the earlier hierarchical meanings of Wa have not been completely erased, but are partially retained in the spatial order. It is not hard to explain why, despite the strong rhetorical claim to represent unchanging culture, the signifying functions of traditions turn out to be anything but invariant over time. Like other modern institutions, traditions are shaped by process of incorporating and recognizing new knowledge and information that Anthony Giddens usefully characterizes as institutional reflexivity. Formalized and strongly ideological, traditions are not, of course, as plastic as commodities of mass consumer capitalism. Adjustments are likely to be sticky rather than continuous and may provoke moments of resistance. Nevertheless, it will be difficult to differentiate tradition from custom solely on the basis of degree of substantive rigidity. Both appear to be remarkably flexible. The puzzle posed by modern traditions is the disjuncture between the rhetorical posture of invariance, the strong claim at the heart of every tradition to represent time-honored beliefs and practices, and their actual historicity. Why is it that startlingly recent origins, frequent tailoring and embellishing, and even shifting signifying functions do not, as a rule, impair tradition's authenticity and authority? The essays in this volume reveal, but do not address, this paradox, which is deeply implicated in the related but separate problematic of public memory. Nevertheless, promoted by Dipesh Chakrabarty's well-warranted criticism of the neglect of affect, it is worth reconsidering as one relevant example the invented tradition of the yokozuna, the highest rank in sumo. As Lee A. Thompson notes, authoritative histories of sumo date the origin of the yokozuna system to November 1789, when two wrestlers were allowed to perform a ring-entering ceremony wearing a white robe around the waist. This privilege continues today. Thompson argues, however, that the modern yokozuna is very much the product of the tournament champion system, a 20th century innovation that placed new emphasis on objective and quantifiable measures of sumo wrestlers' performance. Today, the criteria for appointment to yokozuna rank and the expectations for performance once promoted bear faint resemblance to those of the historic institution. New rules have been added and a good deal of the ritual is new, including the archaizing gestures of the referee's costume and the Shinto-style roof suspended over the wrestling ring, which frame the spectacle. In less than a century, the substantive aspect of the yokozuna tradition has been transformed. Nevertheless, the fact of slim continuity with the original practice has not undermined the status of the yokozuna as a powerful signifier of this ancient and uniquely Japanese tradition of physical prowess. Hence, the prospect of an American-born sumo wrestler meeting the existing requirements for promotion to yokozuna precipitated a moment of cultural crisis, which, Thompson argues, led to a tortured reformulating of the criteria for promotion. The case of a yokozuna lends force to Chakrabarty's critical reminder, which applies to all the essays, of the importance of smelling, tasting, and touching, of seeing and hearing. The sensory dimension of cultural practices, such as traditions. Noting that ideas acquire materiality through the history of bodily practices, they work not simply because they persuade through their logic. Chakrabarti warns against reducing memory to the simple and conscious mental act. The past is embodied through a long process of the training of the senses. The Yokozuna provides a particularly striking reminder of the importance of the performative aspect of invented traditions. Substantive continuity with the historic institution of the Yokozuna may be slender, but the dignified ring-entering ceremony, repeated each day at the opening of the senior division matches, provides the audience with a conceiving sensory spectacle of continuity with an age-old past. The third point to be discussed in relation to invention of tradition is the complicated relationship of modern traditions to social power. Most, though not all, traditions are produced by elites, and some are consciously fashioned as instruments of control. This process is quite clear in the political sphere. In Japan, as through the industrialized world, the rise of the nation-state in the late 19th century produced an outpouring of new national symbols and rites, such as flags, anthems, and holidays, as well as new, e.g., public health, or reorganized, e.g., armed forces, state institutions that created and imposed their own discourses of social control. The idea of the nation, after all, stands as the mega invented tradition of a modern era. The essays in this volume examine developments in the cultural sphere. Here, too, one finds new traditions that served hegemonic interests. Several of these have already been introduced in other contexts. Perhaps the clearest example, however, is provided in Andrew Gordon's discussion of a tradition of Japanese-style management. In the 1890s, industrialists opposed to factory legislation, Gordon pointedly observes, had to concoct the neologism onjo shugi, warm-heartedness, to give a name to the purportedly timeless Japanese custom of benevolent workshop relationships. Yet, examination of even this clear-cut case of invention soon produces a complicated picture. Gordon's discussion, which does not stop with the fact of the invention at the turn of the century, but follows its progress down to the bubble economy in the late 1980s, reveals sharp swings at the level of discourse. Not once, but twice, managers' passionate insistence on preserving Japan's beautiful customs of workplace cooperation and harmony rapidly dissipated when it appeared that greater economic advantage was to be had by adopting Western models. Still, during the periods when Onjo Shugi was out of favor, industrial elites were not able to remake the workplace. To a large degree, management was constrained by the normative as well as the institutional inertia of the discourse of Japanese-style management it had initiated. Inoue Shun's discussion of the modern martial arts tradition shows how easily the inventors of tradition lose control of their progeny. Kano Jigoro, the founder of Kodokan Judo, on which the 20th century martial arts tradition is modeled, was an unapologetic rationalist committed to modernizing the techniques, mode of instruction, philosophy, and organization of the Tokugawa era martial arts. A patriot, Kano was not a narrow nationalist or a social conservative. He opened the Kodokan to women and worked hard to make judo an international sport. Yet, with the rise of militarism in the 1930s and the ascendancy of a xenophobic ethos of Japanese exceptionalism, the idea of the martial arts Kano had pioneered was reinvented by ultranationalists and promoted as a counterweight to Western values, with the express purpose of infusing Japan's bourgeoising modern and largely Western sports culture with Japanese spirit. Up to this point, I have primarily addressed conceptual issues related to the use of invention of tradition as a historic problematic with the aim of revising and perhaps extending the original model. Here, my emphasis shifts from the model to several larger historical themes that emerge from the essays in this volume. The appearance and trajectories of new traditions are important symptoms and therefore indicators of larger social developments. Constitutive of modern cultural formation, they also mirror modern society's anxieties, fissures, and ruptures. The discussion that follows is organized around two themes: the relationship of invented traditions to social conflict and to national identity. Capitalism drives the production of new cultural practices, just as the nation-state mobilizes the production of modern political traditions. In Japan, the beginnings of industrial capitalism can be dated to the last decade of the 19th century, consumer capitalism to the decade following World War I. The discourses of tradition analyzed in this volume are infused with anxiety over new, more sharply delineated and disturbing social divisions. Tenant militancy, rural impoverishment, industrial strikes, sprawling urban slums, periodic violent protests, culminating in the massive rice riots that swept through 368 cities, towns, and villages in the summer of 1918. These and other signs that capitalism was remaking the social landscape in new and frightening ways fueled deep apprehensions. Not surprisingly, new traditions attempted to contain these social visions by imagining a society made whole. One such discourse was the invented tradition of Kyodo-tai, Japanese village community, whose origins Irwin Shiner locates in the mid-19th century, and the development of capitalistic social relations in villages. Following the opening of major ports to unrestricted trade in 1859, a development that greatly stimulated farm by employments and rural manufacture, villages increasingly became polarized between the poor, insecure wage laborers and smallholders, and the wealthy, rural manufacturers, middlemen, moneylenders, and landlords. But the phenomenon of Yonohashi ward renewal uprisings, Shiner suggests, cannot be adequately grasped by Sasaki Junnosuke's influential theory of the revolutionary struggle of the semi-proletariat. Shiner argues, rather, that it should be seen as the attempt by the new rural poor to renegotiate the village via ward renewal as a community in which norms of mutuality and unity are enforced. By the end of the 19th century, the transition to industrial capitalism increasingly accentuated the disparity between the rural and urban sectors, and at the same time, sharpened class divisions within both. The unevenness of capitalist development produced two overlapping but distinct discourses, which addressed and refigured the rural-urban divide. Agrarianism, Noho-shugi, and native ethnology, Minzoku-gaku. Both refined the difference between country and city, though to quite different ends. Louise Young's essay on the stillborn tradition of Manchurian colonization and my essay on the radical agrarianism of the Ibaragi Aikyokai examine the bureaucratic and popular streams of agrarianism in the tumultuous interwar period. The former emanated from the highest level of the bureaucracy, and the latter from village-level activism bitterly critical of the central government. But both imagined the Japanese farm village as the only social space within Japan's capitalist modernity capable of transcending class divisions. While to agrarianists of all stripes the relative poverty of the village was a sign of backwardness, a deplorable social condition that impelled spiritual and political mobilization, Yanagita Kunio and the native ethnology movement he founded celebrated cultural unevenness. As discussed in the essays of Hashimoto Mitsuru and H.D. Harutunian, Yanagita reacted to the social indeterminacy of capitalist modernization by constructing an imaginary folk, Jomin, and space, Chiho, free of social division. Hashimoto argues that Yanagita, unable to go back in time to recover a unified Japan, rendered the diachronic dimension of culture synchronically as center-periphery, thereby creating a space where the true Japan lived on. In Harutunian's striking formulation, Yanagita, Orikuchi Shinobu, and legions of followers searched out practices they believed predated modernity and constructed an imaginary folk, complete, coherent, and unchanging in lives governed by immutable custom. Many scholars read Yanagita as a critic of capitalist modernity, which in some sense he was. But Harutunian's analysis shows that despite a rhetorical opposition, native ethnology actually worked to stabilize capitalism by offering the appearance of an alternative to capitalist modernity. Strenuous denial by capitalists of conflict in Japan's new factories was, of course, the principal impetus to the invention of the discourse and later the practice of Japanese-style management. But anxiety over class also appeared in other, more unlikely places. Jordan Sand's analysis of the invention of home in the late Meiji period primarily revolves around the gendering of domestic space, but also reveals the insecurity of Japan's nascent middle class, hemmed in by the masses of new urban poor on one side, and on the other by the still culturally influential aristocracy of birth. The discourse and architectural practices that promoted the new progressive ideal of the intimate conjugal family, which quite quickly became established as traditional, was part of a broader effort to make middle-class values normative of Japan. Thus, one such reformer at the turn of the century insisted, against all evidence, that Japan was 65% middle class. The second theme that emerges with great clarity is the role of new traditions in the formation of Japanese national identity. Japan specialists, at least, now recognize that below the level of the politically active samurai and wealthy peasant classes, and even here one must speak in qualified terms, Japan did not enter the modern era with a strong or unified sense of national identity. Despite a comparatively high degree of a common ethnicity language, material culture, and religious practice. In Japan, no less than in the newly formed nation states of Europe and America, a sense of being Japanese developed after rather than before the building of a modern state. Following the first phase of economic, social, and cultural modernization, which ended in the late 1880s, the oligarchy launched a broad effort to push the imperial institution to the forefront of the people's consciousness. Drafted at the highest levels of government, such celebrated texts as the preamble to the 1889 Meiji Constitution and the 1890 Imperial Rescript of Education made unbroken dynastic succession the cornerstone of the family state ideology. Their success, Carol Glock has shown, is partly explained by the fact that provincial officials and local notables played a key role in interpreting and disseminating the modern myths of a continuous emperor-centered polity. More recently, Takashi Fujitani has expanded our understanding of the mechanisms of the imperial myth, making by focusing on material vehicles of meaning, such as national ceremonies, holidays, emblems, and monuments, which created a memory of an emperor-centered nationality past that, ironically, had never been known. Fujitani extends his analysis to a torrent of policies, regulating everything from hairstyles to hygiene, which aimed at bringing the common people into a highly disciplined national community and a unified and totalizing culture. Yet, it is important to remember that instilling a consciousness of being imperial subjects was only part of the process of misusing history to create a cohesive Japanese identity. The process involved, in fact, it required the wide circulation of common practices that claimed to represent continuous and stable culture. In other words, tradition contributed to the formation of national identity through the ideological function of collapsing time and reifying space. Dropping new or newly configured cultural practices as tradition removed these practices from historical time. They were read back into the undifferentiated time of the Japanese past, to be recuperated not merely as values and practices that had withstood the test of time, but as signs of a distinct and unified Japanese culture. I am not suggesting that the historical past played no role in the formation of modern Japanese identity. None of the traditional cultural practices we have discussed was cut from whole cloth. Rather, as in the case of the invention of a modern emperor system, cultural traditions were fashioned from both material and discursive antecedents. Even in the clearest cases of instrumental and self-interested invention, that is, the discourse of the industrial paternalism, the capitalists who coined the neologism onjo shugi did not invent the concept of onjo, an old and celebrated norm whose prescriptive meaning was widely understood. The point, rather, is that cultural traditions are chosen, not inherited. Fabrication enters when the rhetoric of Japanese tradition functions to deny the historicity of cultural production. When it authorizes communalism and cultural particularism while obscuring the strategic character of the process through which the past enters the present. Yanagita Kunio's native ethnology is not only an immensely influential tradition in its own right, as demonstrated by its followers. As Hashimoto Mitsuru shows, Yanagita invented the tradition of Japanese tradition by claiming that Japan's preservation of its original culture made Japan unique among modern nations. Countries of the West, Yanagita argued, were disconnected from their past. In Japan, however, tradition lived on in the latent but ubiquitous world of the Aberdeen folk. Citing James George Fraser's classic study, The Golden Bough, Yanagita boasted that only in Japan, where traditional culture lived on, was it possible to have nation-specific folklore studies. Ikkoku Minzokugaku. Like the invention of the Aberdeen folk, Yanagita's remarkable assertion that Japan alone had achieved modernity without cutting itself off from its original culture has meaning only as the assertion of an ideological position. Nevertheless, it draws attention to the specificity of the historical conditions of Japanese modernity. Unlike most of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, Japan was never colonized. Infringement of Japanese sovereignty through the unequal treaty system was largely limited to the commercial sphere. Its retention of sovereignty, in turn, accelerated political, social, and economic modernization, creating the material basis for new forms of cultural production, including tradition, which appeared only after modernization was well underway. More directly, sovereignty ensured that Japanese elites, rather than colonial administrators, did the inventing. The result: in Japan, the invention of tradition furthered the national project of modernization. Here Japan presents a striking contrast with India, where the British were, implicated in the production of those very components of Indian tradition that have in post-colonial times been seen as the principal impediments to full-scale modernity. Simply put, Ito Hirobumi, the principal architect of Japan's modernization project in the latter part of the 19th century, enjoyed a luxury denied to Jawaharlal Nehru more than a half century later. Nehru, because of the powerful prior Orientalizing of pre-colonial Indian culture by the British, had no find evidence of modernity in Indian tradition. For example, he went to pains to argue the scientific temper and approach of Indian thought. Ito, Andrew Barshey tellingly observes, had the freedom to look upon Japan's feudal legacy as an enormous historical opportunity for promoting, for example, the bond between patron and protégé in Japan's modern factories. The strategic use of tradition did in fact further the state's modernization project. The discourses of the spirit of peace and harmony and industrial benevolence are only the most obvious examples. But there were others. Karen Wigan analyzes the forging of a shared primordial Shinano identity among residents of a newly drawn prefecture of Nagano. The invention of regional identities in Meiji, she suggests, played a critical role in extracting financial sacrifices from prefectural residents by giving them an effective stake in the progress of their prefecture. It is sobering to discover how broadly the notion of Japan's particularity was shared. It invaded and partially disarmed even oppositional discourse. Andrew Barshey's analysis of pre-war Marxist historiography shows how Yamada Moritaro's seminal text, Nihon Shihonshugi Bunseki, Analysis of Japanese Capitalism, 1934, inadvertently participated in the discourse of a unique Japanese modernity. Outraged by the social costs and imperialist agenda of the forced march to national wealth and power, Yamada hinged his analysis of Japanese capitalism on semi-feudal land tenure in Japan's villages and the serf-like regime of workers in Japan's dual-structure manufacturing sector, and the serf-like regime of workers in Japan's dual-structure manufacturing sector. Yamada's text, Barshey argues, forged an iron link between discourse of Japanese particularism and historical backwardness whose influence extended far beyond Marxist circles. On this point, at least, the Marxists converged with Japanese-style management. Both asserted that capitalism in Japan was sui generis because the core consisted of pre-modern values and social relations. By constructing tradition at the heart of Japanese capitalism, the preeminent sign of modernity, Yamada unwittingly joined his intellectual enemies in fashioning the myth that capitalism in Japan wasn't really capitalism after all, because of the strength of Japan's tradition. Despite enormous intellectual achievement and moral passion, Barshey concludes, Yamada's analysis missed the invented and strategic character of the process, through which tradition entered the present. Traditions, I noted early on, are normative and established themselves through repetition. Two essays on gendered cultural practices of the pre-war period suggest that tradition is amenable to reform but not to radical change. Jordan Sand analyzes the new gendering of domestic urban space initiated in the late Meiji period by social reformers and middle-class professionals. Focusing equally on architecture and ideology, Sand traces the evolution of the concept of kate, a neologism for home life, from its origins in 19th century Japanese Protestant reformers' moral criticism of feudal family life, to the point where it became a societal norm. A great deal had to be invented. For example, architectural innovations such as the interior corridor, Nakarouka, which divided the interior residential space into separate spheres, and the short-ledged dining table, Chabudai, which introduced the common dining table into the Japanese house and made it possible for the family to eat together. While conservative state ideologues wrote the patriarchal family into the Meiji Civil Code, a more democratic, affect-centered family prevailed in the redesigning of actual living space. What became the iconic, and today nostalgic, image of a traditional Japanese family, consanguine members seated on tatami and gathered around the chabudai to share tea or a meal, in fact originated in turn of a century discourse of architectural and social reform, which drew heavily from the West. In the decade following World War I, Japanese capitalism entered a new stage characterized by the explosive growth of modern media technologies, mass marketing of items of personal consumption, and new forms of entertainment and pleasure seeking. The stylish moga, modern girl, in the 1920s represented bourgeois women's challenge to established gender norms. As Miriam Silverberg argues, the cafe, where rural and urban lower class young women sought employment as waitresses, created a narrow but new social space for the renegotiation of gender relations. But while the cafe and the cafe waitress drew from a long history of female sex workers in food service occupations. The social indeterminacy of the cafe waitress, whose role allowed seduction to go both ways, posed too radical a challenge to gender norms. First restricted and finally prohibited in the period of wartime mobilization, the culture of the cafe and cafe waitress, Silverberg claims, died out. It never became a tradition. In Jennifer Robertson's critical analysis, contemporary furusato zukuri, native placemaking, represents more than a nostalgia for rootedness and wholesome living associated with a farm village. Robertson argues that the effective pull of furusato zukuri, especially to the males who engineer these projects, resides in the equation of furusato with mother, as illustrated in the quite amazing statement of the director of the 1983 movie Furusato. Furusato is the ancestral land, Sokoku. My, our, Waga, ancestral land is Japan. It is Gifu Prefecture. It is Saigo Village. It is the village's subsection, Aza. It is my household. It is mother. This association, Robertson suggests, points to the recuperative aspect of native placemaking in the paternalistic attempt to reconstruct an authentic, ontologically secure representation of stable gender relations in the much less certain present. I noted that tradition is used in two distinct, though overlapping, senses. On the one hand, the past against which the modern is measured, and on the other, specific cultural practices believed to represent cultural continuity. The Edo period, Carol Gluck argues, has functioned since early Meiji as the invented past in relation to which Japan's modernity defined itself. Identified as tradition, Edo was to Meiji Japan what the Ancien Régime was to revolutionary France, a historical imaginary that evoked the past to get to the future. The original invention of Edo occurred in the late 19th century, when commentators conceived the national project in terms of a telos of progress on an east-west axis and made Edo the obverse of the Meiji vision. They mapped Edo using tropes like feudalism, the cultural and economic energies of commoner society, the era of great peace, and Sakoku, a closed country. In every case, from the anti-Edo of the fascist 1930s to the rose-colored Edo of the postmodern 1980s, the period is constructed as the mirror image of a particular modern future. A final point concerns the ideological modalities of the invention of tradition. One of the interesting issues that Chakrabarti raises in his afterword concern the tropes of temporality and effect. Addressing the articles on Yanagita Kunio by H.D. Harutunian and Hashimoto Mitsuru, he distinguishes two modes of temporality in Yanagita's writing: nostalgic and epiphanic. The nostalgic mode corresponds to the familiar sense of belatedness in invented tradition, the ideological construction of a past that must be recovered by adherence to practices of quite recent origin. However, the epiphanic mode rejects the figure of loss and recovery. It escapes from historical time and constructs a vision of eternity, a modern nationalist epiphany produced by a performative agency resistant to state institutions. Citing the examples of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore, and carefully noting that the shadows of both capitalism and the nation-state fall much more heavily and lengthily on our discussion of Japanese history than in South Asian studies, Chakrabarti argues against the notion that the romantic aesthetic nationalism leads inexorably to statist and jingoist fascism. Certainly not everywhere at all times, and probably not again in Japan. The changes in domestic and world political economy since the Pacific War have been epochal, and historical coordinates are always decisive. The evidence of the essays in this volume is sobering, however. In the 1930s and during the Pacific War, only Marxism, with all its modernist baggage, held its ground as an oppositional discourse. Judo, harmony, industrial paternalism, folklore studies, home. These and the other new cultural practices of the pre-war period either actively collaborated with militarism and imperialism, or were severely compromised by not resisting. The subject of my essay, the populist strain of agrarianism, is illustrative in this respect. I characterize the social imagination of Tachibana Kozaburo and Aikyokai as romantic and utopian, epiphanic in Chakrabarti's formulation. In its populist phase, that is, prior to Tachibana involvement in the incident of May 15, 1932, the rhetoric of the Aikyokai was neither nostalgic nor jingoistic, suggesting that utopia posits new social relations in imaginary political space. But Tachibana held this posture only as long as his politics remained local. When he superimposed the ideology of native place on the nation, he allied with fascist elements in the military. H.D. Harutunian's analysis of Yanagita's representation of the Japanese folk is similar and equally bleak. Yanagita was never able to sufficiently differentiate the native place from the boundaries fixed by the state. His communitarian discourse was never able to articulate a sufficiently different narrative from that other place, from the outside, that might lastingly challenge the state's capacity to appropriate whatever version it wished to project as its own. In the end, Harutunian concludes, Yanagita's project of native ethnology supplied ideological support to imperial and colonial policies. The case of India may suffice to show that romantic aesthetic nationalism need not end up in fascism, and there surely are others. But this observation only confirms the potential peril of a rush in historical studies toward the history of subjectivities, particularly if the subject position comes to occupy so much of the historical frame that powerful historical determined structures such as the nation state, capitalism, and the world systems to which they are inextricably linked fade out of the picture. It was different in Japan between the turn of the century and the Pacific War. To varying degrees, but with discouragingly few exceptions, even outside the political sphere, invented traditions aided or did little to obstruct the mobilization of Japanese affective identification with a pernicious vision of a modern nation state, whose demise as a consequence of defeat in the Pacific War was the only welcome consequence of that historic tragedy. Nevertheless, it would be wrong to view the invented traditions of modern Japan only in terms of the ultimate failure in the pre-war period to establish intellectual and cultural autonomy from the state. One also sees many examples of creative responses by ordinary people who resisted the norms and values that conservative elites and the state sought to impose. Upam shows how the Burakumin of Hozu village turned the state-sanctioned norm of cooperation and the mechanism of informal dispute resolution to their advantage in winning restitution of their ancestors' prosperity. In winning restitution of their ancestors' property. Gordon observes that Japanese workers have taken the grant of warm-hearted labor management relations to resist changes inimical to their interests. Sand shows how the ideal of the emotionally bonded residential family, promoted by socially reformers and given material expression by progressive architects, compromised the coldly hierarchical and patriarchal Ie family system beloved by conservative ideologues. Finally, Shiner shows that notions of community have remained a conflicted discourse in the post-war period. These are only a few examples of the significance of individual agency in cultural production. They are all the more meaningful in light of the unrelenting efforts of conservative social forces to monopolize the invention of tradition.